Welcome to the History Maps podcast.
Think about a heavily funded, heavily armed force of about 600 Spanish conquerors setting sail from Europe.
Right.
They are equipped with the absolute finest armor of the 16th century, artillery, cavalry, and a royal mandate to conquer an empire.
Okay, so a very formidable force.
Extremely formidable. But then, fast forward just a few years, that imposing force of 600 has been reduced to just 4 men.
It's just 4 from 600.
Yeah. And they are completely naked, starving on a Texas beach, relying entirely on the charity of the indigenous people they actually intended to subjugate. And they end up having to walk thousands of miles across completely uncharted North American territory just to survive.
It is a stark contrast.
Yeah.
Today, we are taking a deep dive into the Narvaez Expedition of 1527. This is part of our Age of Exploration series. And, if you have ever wondered how thin the line is between conqueror and captive, this deep dive into the historical records will show you.
It really will.
Our goal here is to extract the facts of this journey, examine the complex indigenous cultures they encountered, and analyze how historical narratives are shaped by the survivors.
Yeah, the contrast you just described, that is the core of this historical event. You start with the absolute pinnacle of European imperial ambition, and you end with this profound study in human vulnerability.
Right, the mechanics of a failure this severe.
Exactly. But to understand it, we cannot just look at the shipwreck itself. We really have to look at the architect of the expedition, Panfilo de Narvaez, and the political machinery of Spain under King Charles V.
So let us establish who Panfilo de Narvaez actually is. Because he gets this royal charter for Florida, but he is already a known entity in the Caribbean by this point, right? He has a very specific reputation.
He does, and it is a severely brutal reputation. By the time he begins organizing this particular expedition, Narvaez has already spent years participating in the conquests of Jamaica and Cuba.
And his methods were harsh even for that time.
Exceptionally violent, yeah. Even by the already harsh standards of the era. I mean, he commanded troops during the massacre of Callao in Cuba.
What happened there, specifically?
Well, a village of indigenous people approached his forces peacefully. They were offering food and supplies, and for reasons that frankly defy logic, Narvaez just allowed his troops to slaughter them.
Just unprovoked.
Completely unprovoked. This event was so horrific, it drew the intense condemnation of Bartolomé de las Casas, who was the Spanish friar who extensively documented the abuses of the native populations.
Right. De las Casas is a major source for this era.
He is, and when de las Casas confronted Narvaez about this unprovoked slaughter, Narvaez was largely indifferent. He just brushed it off. So this establishes his operational baseline. He relies on overwhelming force and terror to control a region.
But despite that brutal success in Cuba, he carries a really significant failure on his record before he even looks at Florida. He was publicly humiliated by another Spanish explorer.
He was, and that failure is the psychological engine driving this entire Florida expedition. So in 1520, the governor of Cuba, Diego Velázquez, sent Narvaez to Mexico with a highly specific mission.
Which was to arrest Hernán Cortés.
Right, arrest Cortés. Because Cortés had gone rogue, he was pursuing the conquest of the Aztec Empire against direct orders. So Narvaez arrives on the Mexican coast with a force that outnumbered Cortés by a wide margin.
He had every advantage.
Superior numbers, superior weaponry, and the legal authority of the crown.
So how does someone with every single tactical advantage manage to lose that encounter?
By entirely underestimating his opponent, Cortés did not fight a conventional pitched battle. Instead, he launched a surprise attack in the dead of night during heavy rain at the Battle of Zempoala.
Oh, wow. That is something.
Yeah, Narvaez was completely caught off guard. And during the chaotic fighting, a pikeman struck Narvaez in the face, destroying one of his eyes.
He lost an eye.
Lost an eye, and he was taken prisoner by Cortés. He spent 2 years locked in a fortress in Mexico. And while Narvaez rotted in a cell, Cortés went on to conquer Tenochtitlan, secure unimaginable wealth, and, cement his place in history.
It makes you think of, like, a corporate executive who publicly fails their last venture in the most embarrassing way possible. His rival gets the promotion, gets the wealth, and leaves him entirely disgraced. And now he is risking his life savings and reputation on this high-stakes gamble to prove the world wrong.
It is very similar to an executive, yeah. But we must remember this is an executive legally authorized to wage war, and he is funding this venture through staggering, ruinous debt.
So he is paying for it himself.
Mostly, yes.
Yeah.
When Narvaez finally returns to Spain, he petitions Charles V for a royal charter to colonize Florida. The crown agrees, but under very punishing terms. The king grants permission, but zero funding.
So it is essentially a 16th century venture capital model.
That is a good way to look at it. Narvaez has 1 year to raise an army and fund the expedition himself. So he takes on enormous debt, bringing in wealthy investors. And the charter legally requires him to establish 2 towns of at least 100 people each and build 2 stone fortresses.
But why would investors pour money into a man with such a high-profile failure on his record? I mean, he lost to Cortez and lost an eye.
Because of the prevailing economic delusion of the time. It is often called the myth of the next Mexico.
Ah, right.
The Spanish genuinely believed that the North American landmass held another Aztec or Inca-level empire, just waiting to be plundered. That desperate belief in hidden gold blinded the leadership and the investors to logistical realities.
So he's not going to Florida to map the coastline.
No, not at all. He is going to quickly extract wealth, redeem his shattered ego, and satisfy his creditors.
Right. So the foundation of the expedition is built on haste, debt, and an injured ego. They leave Spain in June 1527, and the fleet contains roughly 600 people, which include soldiers, sailors, friars, wives, and servants. But the moment they reach the Caribbean, the logistical realities start breaking the expedition apart.
They do. The initial fractures occur in Hispaniola. They stop there to gather provisions, and they suffer heavy desertions. Nearly 100 men abandon the fleet.
Wait, why desert so early? They have not even faced any hardship yet, right?
Because the docks of Hispaniola were rife with news about the Ayllon expedition.
What was that?
Well, a year prior, another Spanish explorer, Lucas Vázquez de Ayllon, attempted to settle the coast of present-day Georgia or South Carolina, and it was a complete disaster. Hundreds of colonists died from disease, starvation, and indigenous resistance.
Oh, I see.
So the crew hears these stories, they look at Narvaez's hasty preparations, and they decide the risk is just too high. So Narvaez is bleeding manpower before he even reaches his staging ground.
To stop the desertions, they push on to Cuba to gather more supplies. They arrive in Trinidad, which is a port on the southern coast of Cuba, around October 1527. And Narvaez stays with the main fleet while he sends 2 ships ahead, commanded by his treasurer, Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, to pick up provisions from a wealthy ally.
Right.
But before they can load the cargo, a fierce hurricane hits the coast.
And to understand the devastation there, we have to look at the mechanics of a 16th century hurricane striking wooden galleons.
They were not exactly nimble ships.
No, these ships are heavy, unwieldy, and completely at the mercy of the wind when caught near a lee shore. The storm surge and winds just obliterated the 2 ships.
And Cabeza de Vaca was there.
He was on shore when it hit and barely survived by fleeing into the woods. When the storm passed, 60 men were dead, 20 horses had drowned, and the essential supplies they were meant to gather were entirely lost.
So it causes a severe delay. The surviving men are terrified to sail before the winter weather clears. They wait months, eventually getting grounded on the Canario Shoals, essentially burning through their remaining food and water before they even point their ships toward Florida.
Exactly.
It makes you wonder, at what point does a commander look at the desertions, the destroyed ships, the lost supplies, and the delays, and decide to just cut his losses?
You are looking at a textbook case of the sunk cost fallacy. Narvaez has leveraged his entire fortune and his reputation on this charter. Turning back means debtor's prison and permanent disgrace. So he pushes forward.
He has no other choice in his mind.
Right. And in a state of desperation, he hires a pilot named Diego Mirello. Now, Mirello claims he has extensive knowledge of the Gulf Coast currents and knows the precise location of a deep, safe harbor in Florida.
Let me guess, he does not.
He absolutely does not. Narvaez puts the fate of his battered fleet in the hands of a man whose navigational incompetence will shortly doom them all.
So they push across the Gulf of Mexico, and in April 1528, the fleet finally reaches the western coast of Florida. They drop anchor near Boca Ciega Bay, just north of Tampa Bay. But their actions upon landing show a complete misunderstanding of the environment and the people living there.
They bring their imperial bureaucracy straight onto the sand. The expedition lands, and they immediately read the requerimiento.
So for the listener, what exactly is this document? Why are they reading it on an empty beach?
So the requerimiento was a legal and theological document drafted by the Spanish crown. Its logic was based on papal bulls asserting that the Pope held dominion over the entire earth and had granted the Americas to Spain.
Okay.
The document demanded that the local indigenous people immediately acknowledge the church as the ruler of the world and the Spanish king as their sovereign. And if they refused, the document legally justified a quote-unquote just war, allowing the Spanish to kill or enslave them.
But they are reading this in Spanish to indigenous people who do not speak a word of the language.
Right. It was a performance for the Spanish legal system, not a genuine attempt at communication. It highlights their profound imperial arrogance. They treated the land as a legal vacuum waiting to be claimed.
Just checking a bureaucratic box?
Pretty much. But the misunderstandings escalate quickly. Shortly after landing, they explore a nearby village, likely belonging to the safety harbor culture, and they find Castilian boxes.
European wooden boxes.
Yes, and inside these European wooden boxes are the bodies of dead men covered in painted deer leather.
And the friars on the expedition immediately order the bodies in the boxes to be burned, right? Assuming it is some form of idolatry.
Yes, they burn them. But alongside these bodies, they find pieces of linen, European shoes, iron, and a gold rattle.
A gold rattle, that is the spark.
That is it. When Narvaez sees European goods and a gold rattle in a native village, his confirmation bias just takes over. He assumes this means an advanced, wealthy empire is located just inland, and they have trade networks extending to the coast.
He believes he has found his next Mexico.
He does.
But when we look at the historical and archaeological record of the Gulf Coast, what is the actual origin of that gold rattle?
The reality is deeply ironic. Those goods were not mined or manufactured by a local Florida empire. The Florida Straits and the Gulf Stream were the primary return routes for Spanish treasure fleets sailing from Mexico back to Europe.
Oh, so they are from shipwrecks.
Exactly. Shipwrecks were incredibly common due to hurricanes and reefs. The Calusa and other indigenous groups along the Florida coast had developed a highly sophisticated salvage economy.
So they were just picking this stuff off the beaches.
Yeah, they harvested iron, canvas, and gold from wrecked Spanish galleons that washed ashore. The indigenous people even tried to communicate to Narvaez through sign language that the items came from a vessel lost on the coast.
So they are chasing the ghosts of their own shipwrecked countrymen. They see salvaged Spanish loot and misinterpreted as evidence of unplundered native wealth.
Yes.
And that single misunderstanding drives the fatal tactical error of the entire expedition.
It really does. Driven by the promise of gold and frustrated by the dense, swampy coastal landscape, Narvaez makes a decision on May 1st, 1528. He decides to split his forces.
Split the land and sea forces.
Right. He orders 300 men to march inland to find the supposed empire. The ships carrying the remaining 100 people and the heavy supplies are ordered to sail up the coast and meet the land force at the great harbor the pilot Miruelo promised existed.
Cabeza de Vaca, the expedition's treasurer, strongly opposes this plan. Why is he so against it?
Because Cabeza de Vaca sees the logistical madness of it all. He points out several glaring flaws. First, they are in completely uncharted territory with no maps. Second, their rations are already failing.
You're already hungry.
Yeah. Third, they have no reliable communication method to coordinate a rendezvous. And finally, the pilot Miruelo has already proven he does not actually know the coastline. The promised harbor might not even exist.
It is comparable to leaving a fully stocked base camp without a map, walking into a dense jungle, and relying entirely on the assumption that you will eventually stumble upon a paved road where a rescue vehicle will be waiting. It relies on too many unpredictable variables aligning perfectly.
Cabeza de Vaca voices exactly those concerns, but Narvaez handles the insubordination by attacking Cabeza de Vaca's honor.
How so?
He insinuates his treasurer is afraid. He calls him a coward. And in the strict honor-bound culture of 16th century Spain, Cabeza de Vaca cannot refuse the march without losing his social standing and reputation.
So he is trapped by his own culture's rules.
He is. He formally registers his protest with a notary, but he joins the land force to preserve his honor, knowingly walking into a disaster.
The ships and the land force never reunite. The ships spend nearly a year searching the coastline before finally giving up and sailing back to New Spain.
Yeah, they just leave.
So the 300 men on land are completely isolated. They march north into the territory of the Appalachee, and they find themselves fighting a war on three fronts, really. Starvation, the brutal geography of the Florida swamps, and a highly organized indigenous resistance.
The clash between the Spanish and the Appalachee reveals a very stark contrast in military tactics. The Appalachee were a complex agricultural society, part of the Mississippian mound-building culture. They lived in established towns supported by extensive cornfields.
And what does the Spanish force do?
The Spanish attempt to use the playbook that worked in Mexico. They enter a village, seize the local cacique, the chief, as a hostage, pillage the food stores, and demand submission.
But the Appalachi do not submit. They fight back. How do they counter heavily armored Spanish soldiers?
By utilizing the environment and highly specialized weaponry, the Appalachi respond with relentless guerrilla warfare. They utilize longbows made of red cedar, stringing them with animal sinew.
And these are powerful bows.
The mechanics of these bows are terrifying to the Spanish. The Appalachi warriors are exceptionally tall and strong, capable of drawing bows that the Spanish cannot even bend.
Really?
Yes, they fire heavy river cane arrows with such kinetic force that the projectiles pierce straight through the joints of Spanish plate armor and easily penetrate chainmail.
So the Spanish cavalry, which is usually their greatest advantage, is neutralized.
Completely neutralized. The Appalachi use the swamps, lakes, and dense pine forests to their advantage. They launch quick, devastating ambushes from behind cover and retreat into the water before the Spanish horses can pursue them.
That sounds like a nightmare for soldiers in heavy armor.
It was. The Spanish are trapped in heavy steel armor in the suffocating Florida humidity, continuously harassed by an enemy they can rarely even see.
And the environment inflicts just as much damage.
Yeah.
There is a specific incident at the Suwannee River that perfectly illustrates the breakdown of their military discipline.
Yes.
A Spanish officer named Juan Velazquez ignores direct orders and charges into the deep, swift river on his horse.
And the current just overpowers them. The weight of Velazquez's armor drags him under, and both he and the horse drown.
And what happens next is so grim.
It is. That night, the starving Spanish army drags the drowned horse from the river bottom, roasts it, and eats it.
They ate the horse.
Yeah, that single event is a microcosm of the expedition's rapid degradation. The proud, conquering cavalry is now consuming its own mounts just to survive a few more days.
So, beaten back by the Appalachi arrows, exhausted by the deep mud, and suffering from an outbreak of an unidentified fever, the surviving members of the land force retreat south toward the coast. They reach an area near the present-day St. Mark's River. They find the coastal shallows, but the psychological reality finally crushes them. There are no ships waiting. There is no empire of gold. They are trapped.
And desperation breeds mutiny. A plot develops among the cavalry, the elite, wealthy members of the force. They plan to steal the remaining horses under the cover of darkness and desert the foot soldiers riding back down the peninsula to save themselves.
But Cabeza de Vaca discovers the plot, right?
He does, and he confronts them. He manages to appeal to their sense of duty and honor, thwarting the desertion. They agree to stay together, but they are left with a terrifying conclusion. If they stay in the swamps, they will die of disease and starvation. If they march by land, the Appalachi will kill them.
So the only escape is the sea.
The sea. They decide to build 5 barges from scratch.
Which requires a feat of desperate engineering. They have no shipwrights, no iron forge, no resin, and no canvas. They have to invent the mechanics of their own salvation using only the materials at hand.
It is incredible they even attempted it. To forge tools, they create a crude bellows using wooden pipes and the skins of deer. They build a hot charcoal fire and melt down their own military equipment, crossbows, stirrups, spurs, and swords.
Melting down their weapons.
Right. And from this molten steel, they hammer out crude axes, saws, and nails.
But how do they waterproof a wooden raft without standard naval supplies? You need pitch or tar for that.
They fell pine trees and construct smoldering pits to extract the pine sap, creating a thick pitch. They use this pitch, combined with the fiber from palmetto leaves, to caulk the wooden planks.
And what about the sails and rigging?
They braid hair gathered from the manes and tails of their horses to manufacture rope for rigging, and they sacrifice their own clothing, sewing their linen shirts together to fashion sails.
All the while, the men are starving. To sustain the heavy labor required to fell trees and forge iron, they implement a grim rationing system. Every 3 days, they slaughter one of their remaining horses.
Yeah, the horse meat feeds the workers, and the skin is used to make water pouches.
They literally consume their military advantage to buy the time to build these boats. The site earns the bleak name, the Bay of Horses.
By September 22nd, 1528, they have consumed the final horse. 242 surviving men crowd onto these 5 overloaded, incredibly shallow rafts. The gunwales sit mere inches above the waterline. Yeah, barely floating, and they set sail into the Gulf of Mexico. The psychological shift here is absolute. They arrived on the Florida coast as arrogant conquerors, bringing the full weight of the Spanish Empire to subjugate the land. Now, they are emaciated castaways, entirely at the mercy of the water they are trying to navigate.
And the Gulf of Mexico currents are notoriously tricky. Those flat-bottom rafts are no match for the open ocean. They drift westward for over a month, hoping to ride the coastal current down to the Spanish settlement of Panuco in Mexico.
But they suffer from agonizing thirst. The horsehide water pouches quickly rot, and several men resort to drinking seawater, which leads to fatal dehydration.
And then the November winter storms arrive.
The seasonal shift brings severe cold fronts and violent winds. The fleet of rafts is scattered in the turbulent water. Narvaez, the commander who led them into this whole venture, is on one of the rafts.
What happens to him?
During a freezing night, his raft is caught in a strong current and swept out to sea. He disappears into the dark and is never seen again.
Wow, just gone. So in early November of 1528, a massive storm surge violently washes Cabeza de Vaca's raft, and eventually others, onto a barrier island off the Texas coast. Historians heavily debate the exact location, but it is generally identified as Galveston Island or the surrounding geography. The freezing, battered survivors name it the Isle of Misfortune. They are shipwrecked again, this time with a brutal Texas winter closing in.
And this is where they encounter the Karankawa. To understand this encounter, we must look at how the Karankawa lived. They were a nomadic, coastal people who thrived in an environment the Spanish found completely inhospitable.
What were they like?
They were exceptional archers, tall and physically robust. They lived in portable wigwams made of skins and poles, migrating between the barrier islands and the mainland based on the seasonal availability of oysters, fish, and roots.
And the mosquitoes there are terrible, right?
Brutal. But they developed a brilliant method for dealing with the fierce coastal mosquitoes by coating their skin in a mixture of dirt and alligator grease.
The collision of these two cultures on the beach is just striking. You have the Spanish who just months prior were reading legal decrees of conquest in shining armor, now washed ashore, entirely naked, having lost every possession in the surf.
Right.
They are freezing, emaciated, and crying out in absolute despair. And then the Karankawa warriors arrive on the beach, armed with longbows, ready to investigate the intrusion.
But when the Karankawa witness the sheer human misery of the Spanish castaways, they do not attack.
What do?
They sit down on the sand and begin weeping loudly in sympathy.
Weeping with them.
Yes, it is a complete moral collision. The indigenous people, whom the Spanish considered uncivilized savages, demonstrate profound empathy and charity. They bring the survivors fish and roots, and they literally physically carry the freezing Spaniards back to their campfires to warm them.
That dynamic shatters every expectation the Spanish held. But the charity is pushed to its absolute limit as the winter progresses. The weather on the Texas coast turns freezing.
The winter is devastating. Out of the roughly 80 men who wash ashore, only a fraction survive the exposure.
And the desperation reaches its absolute nadir when a group of 5 Spaniards, isolated in a camp away from the main group, run out of food.
It does. The physiological reality of starvation drives them to the ultimate taboo. They resort to cannibalism.
Oh.
They systematically eat the bodies of their comrades as they die from the cold until only one man remains, surviving on the flesh of the others.
When the Karankawa discover this, what is their reaction?
Absolute horror. The Karankawa culture found the act of consuming human flesh deeply repulsive. It shatters the moral authority the Europeans presumed to possess. The Karankawa look at the Spanish not as civilized beings, but as something monstrous.
I mean, you can understand why.
Exactly. And furthermore, the Spanish bring a biological weapon with them, European disease. A stomach illness spreads rapidly through the Karankawa, wiping out half their population.
The Karankawa naturally blame the Spanish for the outbreak.
They do. The power dynamic shifts immediately from charity to deep mistrust and hostility. By the time the spring arrives, the surviving Spaniards are essentially enslaved by the local tribes.
Enslaved?
Yes, they are forced into the hardest labor, tasked with digging edible roots from the freezing shallow bays until their fingers literally bleed.
And the numbers continue to drop. Over the next few years, through disease, the brutal labor conditions, and failed attempts to escape down the coast, almost everyone perishes. Out of the original 600 who left Spain, only 4 men eventually lived to see the end of this journey. To understand how they navigated this hostile landscape, we must look closely at who they were, focusing on the most marginalized yet perhaps the most vital member of the group.
The 4 survivors are Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, Alonso del Castillo Maldonado, Andrés Dorantes, and a man known as Estevanico. If we want to understand the mechanics of survival in this environment, we have to look deeply into Estevanico's background.
His presence is often reduced to a footnote in older historical texts. Who was he and how did he end up on this beach?
Estevanico was a Moor, an Arabic-speaking black man from Azamor.
Where's that?
Azamor was a major coastal port in Morocco, a real hub of culture and trade. But in 1513, the Portuguese conquered the city. And during the subsequent upheaval, Estevanico was sold into slavery around 1522 and eventually purchased by the Spanish nobleman Andrés Dorantes.
Okay, so he came as a slave.
Yes. Estevanico was raised Muslim in Morocco but was baptized Catholic, which was a legal requirement imposed by the Spanish crown for anyone traveling to the Americas. He is actually the first recorded person of African descent to enter the American West.
Yet, when Cabeza de Vaca writes the official report for the King of Spain years later, Estevanico is deeply marginalized. He's frequently referred to merely as the black or the slave. His agency is almost entirely erased from the text.
Right, and this introduces a critical concept in historical analysis often called the subaltern voice.
The subaltern.
Yes, the subaltern refers to the marginalized, the enslaved, the people at the bottom of the power structure whose perspectives are excluded from the official record.
So Cabeza de Vaca writes him out of the story.
Essentially, yes. The official narrative was carefully crafted by Cabeza de Vaca to highlight his own piety, leadership, and suffering, mostly to secure a new job from the king. It systematically writes out the contributions of the enslaved man. But if you read between the lines, examining the logistical realities of their movement, it becomes clear that Estevanico's linguistic and cultural adaptability was the primary engine of their survival.
How did he facilitate their survival? What specific skills did he bring?
Well, coming from Azamor, which was a cosmopolitan trade hub, and having navigated the slave trade, Estevanico possessed a high aptitude for languages. The Texas Plains were home to dozens of different linguistic groups. To facilitate trade, these indigenous groups utilized a highly developed intertribal sign language.
And Estevanico learned it.
He mastered this sign language rapidly. While the three Spanish noblemen often held back, bound by their rigid cultural protocols, Estevanico served as the advance scout.
He went first.
He was the one walking into unknown villages, making the first contact, deciphering the local politics, and negotiating their safe passage.
He acts as the vital bridge between the survivors and the indigenous world. Stripped of their weapons, their armor, and their imperial status, the four men had to undergo a profound reinvention. They could no longer rely on force or the threat of violence.
No, not at all.
They endured years of harsh labor, passed around as captives among different indigenous groups along the coast and inland plains. So how do you construct a new identity to survive when your original identity as a conquistador is utterly useless?
You observe what the host culture values, and you fulfill that role.
Which was what?
They reinvent themselves as medicine men. The indigenous groups they lived among had strong shamanistic traditions. They believed that spiritual power was inherently tied to the physical ability to heal the sick. The indigenous leaders demanded that the four strangers use their presumed spiritual power to cure ailments.
And the methods they use are a fascinating blend of their Orthodox Catholic faith and indigenous expectations. They breathe on the sick, they make the sign of the cross over them, and they recite Christian prayers aloud, like the Pater Noster and the Ave Maria.
And remarkably, the patients claimed to feel better.
Right, really?
Yeah. Whether through a placebo effect, the natural course of the illnesses, or the psychological comfort of the ritual, the fame of their healing powers begins to spread across the trade routes.
That is wild.
It is. The most compelling instance of this occurs when Cabeza de Vaca is forced to perform actual physical surgery.
Let us detail the medical reality of this. An indigenous man is brought to him with an arrowhead lodged deep in his chest near his heart.
Right, and Cabeza de Vaca has no surgical training and no sterile equipment.
So what does he use?
He uses a piece of sharpened flint. Flint, when fractured correctly, can hold an edge sharper than modern surgical steel, which allowed for a surprisingly clean incision. He cuts the man's chest open, locates the arrowhead, and successfully extracts it.
With flint.
With flint. He then uses a needle fashioned from deer bone and thread made from animal sinew to stitch the wound closed. And against all odds, the man recovers without succumbing to infection.
That surgery fundamentally changes their status. They are elevated from mere captive healers to something approaching divine figures in the eyes of the native populations. The indigenous people begin treating the four men with intense reverence.
They do.
Thousands of people begin following them as they walk westward, acting as an enormous protective escort. They refer to the four men as children of the sun.
And there is a deep psychological divergence in how this phenomenon is interpreted. Cabeza de Vaca views these healings strictly through a 16th century Catholic lens. He believes the Christian God is performing literal miracles through his hands to ensure his survival, with the ultimate goal of Christianizing the native populations.
But the indigenous people see it differently.
Very differently. They are integrating the four men into their existing spiritual frameworks. They view them as powerful shamans, capable of channeling energy to heal. The survival of the four depends entirely on playing the shamanistic role perfectly, adopting the gourds, the feathers, and the rituals expected of them.
So they walk for years, they traverse the brutal deserts of Texas, cross the Rio Grande, walk into the American Southwest, and finally turn south into the rugged terrain of northern Mexico. They're constantly searching for the Spanish Empire.
Always looking for a way back.
And in July 1536, near the Sinaloa River in Culiacan, they finally find it. But the reunion is not a celebration, it is deeply disturbing.
It is a complete moral collision of two vastly different worlds. The four survivors, accompanied by their vast retinue of indigenous followers, suddenly encounter a group of Spanish slave catchers.
Oh no.
Yeah, this group is led by a captain named Diego de Alcaraz.
The visual contrast must have been staggering. You have the Spanish slavers on horseback, heavily armed, clad in metal armor, representing the brutal, extractive reality of the colonial frontier economy.
Right.
And emerging from the brush are Cabeza de Vaca, Dorantes, Castillo, and Estevanico. They are barefoot, their skin is deeply weathered from 8 years of sun exposure, they are dressed in animal skins carrying shamanistic gourds, and they are protected by thousands of indigenous people.
The slave catchers are completely dumbfounded. They stare at Cabeza de Vaca in utter silence, unable to comprehend that this sun-baked, skin-clad shaman speaking to them in perfect Spanish is a nobleman from a fleet lost nearly a decade ago.
I can imagine the shock.
But the shock quickly evaporates and turns into a tense standoff. Alcaraz and his men operate within the encomienda system, a labor system that rewarded conquerors with the labor of particular groups of subject people. They see the vast indigenous following not as a protective escort, but as a highly lucrative commodity.
So they want to enslave the people who saved Cabeza de Vaca.
They immediately declare their intention to capture and enslave them.
Cabeza de Vaca vehemently opposes this. He has spent years living among these people, suffering with them, learning their languages, and healing their sick. He orders Alcaraz to stand down.
And the most revealing moment of this entire encounter comes from the indigenous followers themselves.
What do they do?
Well, when Alcaraz tries to manipulate the natives, telling them through an interpreter that Cabeza de Vaca and his companions are actually of the same race as the slavers, and therefore the natives should submit to the slavers' authority, the indigenous people flatly refuse to believe it.
They reject the idea that these two groups of Europeans are the same people.
They do. They point out the fundamental behavioral differences. They tell Alcaraz that Cabeza de Vaca and his friends came from the sunrise, while the slavers came in the sunset. The survivors heal the sick, while the slavers kill the healthy. Yeah, the survivors covet nothing and give away whatever they are given, while the slavers seek only to steal and plunder. To the indigenous people, the four survivors and the slavers belong to completely different moral universes.
Cabeza de Vaca realizes the extreme danger his followers are in. He eventually convinces the indigenous people to return to their homes to escape capture. He instructs them to build churches and hide from the Spanish patrols.
Right.
The devastating tragedy is that he later realizes the slavers deceived him. Once the four survivors were moved out of the area under military escorts, Alcaraz and his men doubled back, tracked down, and likely enslaved many of those very followers who had kept the four men alive.
It is terrible. But the encounter highlights the profound internal transformation of Cabeza de Vaca. He entered Florida intending to conquer, extract wealth, and subjugate the population through violence. He returns to Mexico City fundamentally altered by his shared suffering. He begins vigorously advocating to the Viceroy of New Spain for the humane treatment of the indigenous populations, arguing that kindness, understanding, and peaceful Christianization are the only legitimate ways to interact with them.
The physical journey ends in Mexico City, but the narrative of the journey is immediately seized and reshaped by the imperial machinery. The fates of the four survivors diverge wildly, reflecting the strict social hierarchy of the empire.
They do?
Cabeza de Vaca returns to Spain. In 1542, he publishes his account, La Relación. He writes it to justify his actions, explain the loss of the king's investment, and secure a new royal appointment. His lobbying works. He is made governor of the Rio de la Plata in South America.
But ironically, his strict attempts to enforce more humane, peaceful treatment of the natives there anger his own profit-driven men. They stage a mutiny, and he ends up imprisoned and sent back to Spain in chains.
And the fate of Estevanico is particularly compelling and tragic. Because he is legally classified as an enslaved man, he cannot simply return to Spain, write a memoir, and petition the king.
No, he cannot. Andrés Dorantes either sells him or transfers his ownership to Antonio de Mendoza, the viceroy of New Spain. Now, Mendoza has heard the rumors that Cabeza de Vaca recorded in his official reports, rumors passed along the indigenous trade routes of large, wealthy, permanent settlements to the north.
The cities of gold.
Right. These rumors rapidly morph in the Spanish imagination into the legend of the 7 cities of Cibola. Mendoza needs an experienced guide to lead a reconnaissance expedition to find these cities, and Estevanico is literally the only man in the empire qualified for the job.
So in 1539, Viceroy Mendoza sends Estevanico ahead to guide a Franciscan friar, Fray Marcos de Niza, into the unknown north. Estevanico travels in advance with a large group of indigenous allies. He employs the exact same mechanics that kept him alive in Texas.
The shaman role.
Yes. He carries a medicine man's gourd adorned with owl feathers, he wears bells on his ankles, and he assumes the powerful role of a healer and diplomat. He establishes a communication system with Fray Marcos, sending messengers back, carrying wooden crosses. The physical size of the cross indicates the importance and size of the settlements he is discovering.
And one day, an indigenous messenger arrives at Fray Marcos's camp carrying a cross that is as tall as a person.
A giant cross.
Yes. Estevanico is nearing the Zuni pueblo of Hawiku, located in present-day New Mexico. Hawiku was a complex, multi-story settlement constructed of stone and adobe. But when Estevanico approaches the pueblo, the diplomatic mechanics fail. The inhabitants do not welcome him as a revered healer.
And the historical sources from the Spanish who followed later state that the Zuni killed him.
They do.
What caused the breakdown in communication? Why did the Zuni execute the most experienced diplomat on the continent?
Well, the historical records offer several theories based on Puebloan culture. Some historians suggest the Zuni perceived him as a spiritual threat. In the religious traditions of some Pueblo groups, there is a figure known as the Chacuana Cachina.
What is a Kachina?
A Cachina is a spirit being, an ancestral messenger. The Chacuana Cachina is often associated with the direction of the south, warfare, and is sometimes depicted with dark features. Some folklore connects the sudden appearance of Estevanico to this specific spirit, causing alarm.
Okay, so a spiritual misunderstanding.
That is one theory. Another prominent theory focuses on his medicine gourd. Estevanico carried a gourd decorated with owl feathers, a symbol of his power among the Plains tribes. However, in Puebloan cultures, owls are frequently associated with death, witchcraft, and dark magic.
Oh, so presenting that was a huge mistake.
Presenting an owl-feathered gourd to the Zuni leaders was a catastrophic cultural mistranslation. Furthermore, he demanded tribute and women, which was customary for the powerful shamans he was imitating on the plains. But the Zuni chiefs may have viewed this as an intolerable threat from a hostile sorcerer, deciding to kill him before the armed force they assumed was following him could arrive.
There is another theory proposed by some modern historians that completely subverts the tragic narrative. Is it possible he faked his own death? Did he use the confusion and conflict at Hawiku as a smokescreen to finally slip away, escaping Spanish servitude forever to live freely among the indigenous trade networks he understood better than anyone?
It is a compelling speculative theory that honors his relentless drive for survival and his immense adaptability. However, the official Spanish record concludes he was killed, as Fray Marcos reported hearing the news from terrified indigenous allies fleeing the pueblo.
Right, that is the official record.
Regardless of his final moments, the ultimate legacy of the Narvaez expedition is deeply ironic. Cabeza de Vaca wrote his account partly to warn the crown of the harsh realities of the continent and to advocate for peaceful integration. But by simply mentioning the rumors of copper, emeralds, and permanent settlements, he inadvertently provided the fuel for the next wave of destructive exploration.
It just kept going.
His detailed report directly sparked the enormous, heavily armed expeditions of Hernando de Soto into the American Southeast and Francisco Vázquez de Coronado into the Southwest. They went looking for the golden empires that Narvaez failed to find, bringing devastating disease and warfare much deeper into the North American continent.
We only know the intimate details of this expedition, the starvation in the swamps, the desperate boat building, the mechanics of their survival, and the years of enslavement because Cabeza de Vaca survived to write a report to appease his king. He controlled the narrative structure of the event.
He did.
But consider this for a moment. If Estevanico, the indigenous guides who navigated the plains, or the Appalachian warriors who defended their cornfields had possessed the printing presses of Europe, how entirely different would the recorded history of North America look today? It serves as a stark reminder that history is not just an objective record of what happened, but a narrative shaped entirely by the person who survives to write it down.
That is a very powerful way to look at it.
Thank you for listening. History Maps. Learn history visually.